All right, so we are at time. It's 10 and I see participants joining now. So I'll just give it a minute and then we can get started. All right, good morning, evening, everyone joining from the Western Hemisphere. Welcome to the regional workshop on good regulatory practices and medical device regulation. I'm Mugant, the Southeast Asia lead for the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, or the MDRC, and I will be facilitating this two-day workshop. This workshop is conducted in English and it is being recorded for learning purposes and also for reference, and will be made available online on the MDRC website, and we will share the link in the chat box separately. So this workshop today is going to feature discussions on the World Trade Organization, or WTO's Technical Barriers to Trade, or TBT agreement, and legal obligations as it relates to GRPs, or good regulatory practices, and national commitments, assessment of safety and performance of medical devices, regulatory reliance models for medical device assessment, and post-market surveillance. These are aimed at promoting GRPs as a benchmark for developing and implementing high-quality, cost-effective, and efficient regulatory oversight in the healthcare sector. We have with us today representatives from the national standards organizations in ASEAN, the ASEAN Medical Device Committee, private sector, industry associations, and the US government. This workshop is part of the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, or as I mentioned, the MDRC. It is a US government-funded public-private partnership between USAID and the American National Standards Institute in collaboration with the Advanced Medical Technology Association, or ADVMET. We have senior officials from USAID and ADVMET who will speak to this shortly, so I'll hand the floor over to them. But before that, I would like to thank the ASEAN Medical Device Committee, the chairs, and the ASEAN Secretariat for their support for this workshop. This is the first regional workshop under the MDRC, and we look forward to engaging individual ASEAN member states and ASEAN collectively to advance regulatory convergence on medical devices. I would like to also extend my appreciation to the speakers who have offered their time and expertise to this workshop, some of them joining at very inconvenient times. Final housekeeping, everyone should be muted unless you're presenting. We welcome questions and comments. Please drop them in the Q&A section in the bottom half of your Zoom screen at any time, and the moderators and panelists will address them, and we'll try to address as many of your questions as time permits. So let's get started. Let me invite Carl Fickenschner, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator from the Bureau for Development, Democracy and Innovation, USAID, to deliver the opening remarks. Carl, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mugan. Good morning, all. Greetings from Washington, D.C. It's a little bit later than you are, or actually a little bit much later than you are. On behalf of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, it's a pleasure to be here to open this virtual regional workshop on good regulatory practices in medical device regulation with the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations Medical Device Committee. I want to say good morning as well to fellow speakers, Mohammed Abdulghani, Vice Chair of the ASEAN Medical Device Committee, colleagues from the AMDC, national standards organizations, and representatives from the medical technology sector and industry associations. I'd like to thank the ASEAN MDC, or Medical Device Committee, for graciously extending their partnership and collaboration on this workshop, and for all that we've achieved together as partners with the ASEAN Secretariat that facilitated these arrangements. I'd also like to recognize the support we received from our U.S. interagency partners and from private sector stakeholders. A warm welcome to you all. The COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, MDRC for short, is a result of an incredibly fruitful public-private partnership between and among USAID, the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, and the Advanced Medical Technology Association, or ADVMET, under the umbrella of the Standards Alliance. Since its launch, more than 1,000 government officials and industry professionals have benefited from the technical assistance relevant to medical devices provided by the MDRC. This global activity already has a number of notable accomplishments. For instance, in Colombia, the Ministry of Health received a national award on regulatory improvement policy applicable to medical devices because of the work they have done with the MDRC to improve the quality of their regulatory practices. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated the central role national regulatory authorities play in public health, including speeding access to safe and quality medical devices. The pandemic underscored that these authorities need not act alone during a health emergency or global crisis, nor should they do so. It also demonstrated the capacity that the private sector has to promptly and effectively respond to health emergencies. At the same time that industry in high-income countries were producing effective medical devices, we saw how regulatory bottlenecks and choke points sometimes prevented medical technologies from reaching countries and points of care, limiting patients' access to life-saving equipment such as in vitro diagnostics and quality healthcare. It was in this context we started our partnership with industry to help strengthen the medical device regulatory ecosystems. Together with the private sector, USAID supported the capacity of our partner countries to develop sound legal and regulatory frameworks, high product standards, and conformity assessment procedures. We also provided tools for effective private sector engagement, all of which were critical to providing medical technology to address and recover from COVID-19 and prepare for future health emergencies. These efforts to align the U.S. ASEAN Health Futures Initiative strengthen health system capacity. MDRC is an excellent example of USAID's commitment and partnership to work closely and strategically with the private sector to deliver innovative programs. Our administrator, Samantha Power, has made it a priority to engage the private sector in a way that helps mobilize more resources on core priorities that seek broader changes, not only on single opportunities. Our agency is committed to transforming the way in which U.S. foreign assistance is conceived, designed, and delivered. Strategic collaborations with partners such as ANSI, AdvaMed, and AMDC help us obtain greater scale, sustainability, and effectiveness in our programs. Together, we can catalyze, change, and strengthen local economies in a way that expands opportunities for all, improving security and stability, creating better conditions for communities to thrive, and build new markets. I have confidence that the results of our collaboration with the private sector that we see today, where the private sector leads the execution of technical assistance, engages to resolve trade and import barriers, encourages other governments and donors to explore similar avenues of collaboration with industry, all result in market-based solutions to economic growth challenges in the critical healthcare sector. I'm sure that our private sector partners will welcome such opportunities to build upon that firm foundation laid by the MDRC. Today's discussion will greatly advance our agency's work with you on standards within our economic growth and trade strategies. We also recognize that this work is integral to improving the safety, efficacy, and quality of medical devices, and therefore has implications for strengthening the health of people throughout the ASEAN region. Those who are attending today understand the significance of standards to your economies and of establishing fundamental regulatory principles and other good regulatory practices to facilitate the work of regulatory authorities for developing high-quality technical regulations in the medical device sector. USAID will continue engaging in this field, aiming to foster economic growth and advance global health, strengthen our partners' national quality infrastructures, and support efforts to comply with international commitments regarding technical barriers to trade, such as those made part of the WTO. As you embark on your regulatory discussions, keep in mind that future economic growth and trade will be created by new and increasingly accelerated technological advances, like those spearheaded by the medical device industry. The landscape of products that will arrive in the market tomorrow will continually evolve as a result of innovation. Under these conditions, regulatory capacities will be challenged. We can work together to mitigate the stress by strengthening systems that leverage and adapt global knowledge and that foster collaboration with other peer agencies around the world. We can further mitigate the regulatory challenges by relying on work performed by global regulatory leaders such as US FDA. The future will require regulatory interconnectivity that simultaneously facilitates trade, helps establish reliant supply chains, and provides adequate regulatory oversight to facilitate market access and promote public health. I'm hopeful that the information shared today will strengthen the resiliency of the region by preparing us for the next crisis and avoiding medical device market failures from happening again. Before we start the program, I wish to acknowledge the hard work and the leadership of the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project team put into organizing this event. I look forward to learning about the outcomes and potential to bring the successful program to scale following the engagements you will have. I wish everyone a fruitful and productive workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carl, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I'll now like to invite Mohammed Asmi Abdugani, Vice Chair of the ASEAN Medical Device Committee, to deliver the welcome remarks.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. Distinguished Mr. Carl Fickenshire, Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator, Bureau for Development, Democracy and Innovation. Distinguished Mr. Stephen Bypass, Vice President for Global Strategy and Analysis at BAMET. Distinguished heads of the MDRC project team. Distinguished panel of moderators, experts, and presenters. Distinguished heads of ASEAN delegates. Distinguished ASEAN participants and guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to all of you, and to some of you, good afternoon and good evening. Firstly, I would like to thank the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence MDRC project team for having me to welcome the participants at the virtual regional workshop on good regulatory practices and medical device regulation. It is my pleasure to address the audience of this workshop with all the participants and experts from 10 ASEAN member states in the community. To the representatives from the ASEAN Consultative Committee for Standards and Quality, ACCSQ, ASEAN National Standards Organizations, ASEAN Medical Device Committee, AMDC, ASEAN Member States Ministries of Health and other regulatory agencies, AMS industry associations and partners, US government entities, and medical device companies, it is my honor to warmly welcome you all to this workshop. Ladies and gentlemen, the ACCSQ was formed by the ASEAN Economic Minister in 1992 to facilitate and complement the objectives of ASEAN Free Trade Area. At the 4th Senior Economic Officials Meeting, SEOM, held in Medan, Indonesia on 8 to 10 September 1997, the SEOM agreed to the presence of regulatory bodies in the ACCSQ in order to achieve its mandate of eliminating technical barriers to trade posed by the regulations. To achieve its mandate, the ACCSQ further formed its working groups and product working groups. The ASEAN Medical Device Committee, AMDC, was formed in 2014 to coordinate the implementation of the ASEAN Medical Device Directive, AMDD, which is an agreement between the 10 ASEAN member states to harmonize medical device regulatory framework. The key objective is to facilitate trade and market access of medical devices in ASEAN by reducing technical barriers and to facilitate the economic integration initiatives for medical device products without compromising their quality, safety, and performance. Since then, a lot of deliverables have been achieved by AMDC to support ACCSQ's immediate priorities and commitments of eliminating technical barriers to trade, from strengthening the framework for cooperation in standards development through the adoption of harmonized medical device standards and harmonized risk classification of medical devices, from reviewing and accelerating ongoing market integration initiatives through the implementation of the MDD, and from coordinating and cooperating with regard to representation on new and developing issues in international and in Asia-Pacific regional organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that through the MDRC project and this workshop, we continue to support and complement ASEAN's effort to strengthen the implementation of standards, guidance, and good regulatory practices related to medical devices. At the conclusion of this workshop, I hope that participants will gain a deeper appreciation of the rationale of the standards and guidance issued by regional and international medical device frameworks, have better awareness of the avenues available to seek assistance translating regional and international medical device framework into the national context, and have a benchmark reference of case studies and best practices in regulatory reliance models and in managing the safety and performance of medical devices. Before I end my welcome remarks, allow me to thank the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project team, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and the Advanced Medical Technology Association, ADVAMED, for the continued partnership and for the realization of this virtual workshop. Finally, I wish all of us a fruitful and successful workshop. I am confident that with active participation from all ASEAN member states, this event will be successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me once again express our appreciation for the AMDC's support for this workshop. Up next, we have Stephen Bipes, Vice President for Global Strategy and Analysis at ADVAMED, to deliver introductory remarks. Stephen, please.
Thank you, Megat, and good morning to all. First, I'd like to extend my gratitude to USAID, represented here today by Carl, for the excellent partnership and working with his whole team on the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project. And I'm particularly excited about this MDRC workshop today and tomorrow working with ASEAN. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge the ASEAN Medical Device Committee and its Vice Chair, Azni Abghani, for the opportunity to engage and put emphasis on the content we'll be reviewing over these 2 days. ADVAMED is pleased to serve as the leading private sector partner of the MDRC project, working with USAID and the American National Standards Institute under the Standards Alliance Initiative. In this role, ADVAMED brings together the global medical technology industry with our support of the GMTA, the Global Medical Technology Alliance, the GDA, the Global Diagnostics Alliance, and our many private sector partners across the ASEAN region. In this cooperative structure, we have been able, under the MDRC, to bring leading private sector technical experts and their expertise together with the best practices of leading and referenced national regulatory authorities, with a collective focus on implementing international best practices to the global effort in medical device regulatory convergence. The MDRC has been working globally to identify bottlenecks between patients and life-saving medical technologies, particularly in the context of recovering and emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic and in preparations for future global health emergencies. And our diagnosis of these barriers, the largest of them are regulatory non-alignments. So the MDRC team has been working at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level to strengthen health systems, in particular medical device regulatory frameworks, with a focus on sharing of best practices and on the implementation of foundational good regulatory practices as they are applied to the regulation of medical devices. These best practices come from well-identified sources, such as the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, the IMDRF, the Global Harmonization Working Party, the GHWP, the World Health Organization, the WHO, and various standards developing organizations. But these best practices also come from entities such as the World Trade Organization, the WTO, whose trade rules actually constitute a core subset of foundational good regulatory practices, which we will refer to throughout the sessions as GRP. The WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement includes provisions such as use of international standards as a basis for national technical regulations. It also includes the notification of draft and final technical regulations, trade commitments that can go some distance in the global efforts toward medical device regulatory convergence. We've sometimes come across the perception that international standards can be too onerous or serve as a competitive disadvantage, but that they are somehow difficult to implement. From the MDRC experience, we have actually found the opposite, where national technical regulations and standards and conformity assessment mechanisms that are not based upon international standards actually have the effect of isolating particular economies. As the global medtech industry seeks to expand and broaden its global manufacturing footprint, it is critically important that medtech manufacturers, independent of their location and size, have access to the global medtech supply chain. And this chain is built upon international standards. An economy can have a dozen national medtech industries, but they require inputs from and an export market to the global medtech supply chain. One of the tools we will talk about over the coming days is a checklist, which we've been using as a helpful tool for national regulatory authorities in their medical device regulatory development to ensure their compliance with international foundational good regulatory practices. The WTO TBT agreement is one such mechanism. But the checklist has been particularly helpful, and in the case cited in Colombia, is now part of an official policy enabling the Ministry of Health and the National Regulatory Authority to ensure, as a part of their quality management system, that they are complying with the solid legal foundation in the basis of the technical regulations that they develop for medical technologies. So I will now briefly overview our workshop sessions and outline how we will stitch this message together. Our first session today, day one, is focused on discussing the global perspective of the benefits of the utilization of good regulatory practices, including the use of international standards and references, and as well as having the participation of global experts in the development of updating technical regulations and standards. For this, we have representatives from the World Trade Organization, as well as the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, to overview this information from the cross-sectoral and trade perspectives. For the second session, we will be learning from various stakeholders, including the World Health Organization, from national regulatory authorities, and the medtech industry, on the opportunities and challenges being faced by the various available convergence initiatives while developing and implementing regulatory frameworks for the medtech sector. And lastly, today, we will have the opportunity to learn on a success story on the utilization of international standards and conformity assessment from the United States Food and Drug Administration on their methodology to align with the global standards to efficiently ensure safe medical technology for patients in the US. For day two, beginning in the first session, as the natural segue to designing more efficient and effective regulatory frameworks, we will be discussing diverse reliance mechanisms that have already been applied, starting with the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which is probably the widest and most successful example of reliance applied, in this case, to quality management systems for medical devices. We will continue to learn from Singapore and the Philippines on how CTDT has been utilized by the latter under a reliance mechanism and how it may be extensively adopted to facilitate and expedite patient access to the required medtech. To close the workshop, we will review what is being acknowledged as an element of increasing importance post-market surveillance. Having reliance and recognition mechanisms becoming more of a common practice and priority, the role of market surveillance is also acquiring increased relevance, as it will become the mechanism by which regulators and all relevant stakeholders will confirm that the decisions made through reliance and recognition mechanisms are adequate as to ensure patient safety. With this, we will be covering most of the life cycle of medical technology from the perspective of GRP, reliance and recognition, and as mechanisms to more efficiently and effectively serve patients around the globe. I wish you all an educational and constructive workshop and look forward to the proceedings. Please don't be shy during the question and answer sessions. Thank you, Mugant. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, for outlining the MDRC's objectives and the goals of this two-day workshop. We'll start off discussions on good regulatory practices and standards focused on the WTO TBT agreement, particularly how commitments can be translated and implemented at the national level. Marina Carvalho, the MDRC GRP lead, will lead the session, and she's joined by Renee Hancher, Director of Regulatory Policies at the Office of WTO and Multilateral Affairs with the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Devin McDaniels, Deputy Secretary, WTO TBT Committee, is unable to join us live, so he has kindly shared a pre-recorded video for the audience. I'll hand the floor over to Marina to introduce the session and take questions, if any, after. Marina, over to you.
Thank you, Mugan. Thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all of you. As it was already introduced by my previous speakers, in this first session, we are going to discuss briefly how the international good regulatory practice can actually serve as a tool to implement transparency and technical regulation that are consistent with international rules. This presentation will discuss the elements of the WTO TBT agreement, the legal obligations that relates to good regulatory practice, and it will try to liaise how the TBT agreement and countries can bring together internal rules and at the same time implement international commitments at the national level. It's very interesting to have this panel today because it's going to set the first stage of a great discussion that we're going to have in the next 2 days, which deals specifically with the challenge of implementing GRPs and make it practical in the day-to-day life of our national authorities. So to begin with this discussion, we thought about bringing someone from the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to talk a little bit about the TBT agreement and how the international rules define the main obligations on good regulatory practices and how technical rules can be constructed in a way that it does not become a barrier to trade. So Devin McDaniels were not able to be here as it was advanced, but he recorded a presentation which I'm going to pass to all of you right now. And I can take questions, and we are pleased to share them with Devin afterwards. And obviously, if I can help, I'm always here as well to support in anything. And then after that, we can have the speech of our dear Rini Hancher, which is here with us today. But first, let's go to the Devin McDaniels presentation. Devin is the Deputy Secretary of the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee. Mugan, do you have the presentation with you?
I believe Letitia will be screening. Yep.
Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Devin McDaniels. I work at the World Trade Organization Secretariat, dealing especially with the Committee on Technical Barriers to Trade. And so the idea of my presentation today will be to introduce to you the framework of the TBT agreement and why it's so important for national regulatory authorities and medical device regulation. So I should be sharing my screen now, and great. Yes, so I mean, I'll begin by just again mentioning and recalling that the WTO framework of agreements, we have one specific agreement called the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, which deals with the relationship between standards, international standards, regulations, and trade. And I think what's really important to keep in mind at the core of this agreement is the balance that's struck in the agreement between, on the one hand, ensuring and protecting the right of all WTO members to regulate for legitimate objectives, of which health is one of, if not one of, one of the very important legitimate objectives. And on the other hand, to ensure that when regulating, when carrying out regulations, preparing, adopting, applying regulations, members do so in a way which doesn't unnecessarily restrict trade or discriminate between domestic and foreign producers or producers from different countries or economies. And that balance is sort of this at the core of the agreement. And one very important factor that is a little bit special about the TBT agreement as well is the reliance on the use of international standards, which provides a common basis for harmonization across economies to ensure that, regulators are using the best technical knowledge available to them. And also that when they regulate and base on when regulators use the international standards, that allows trade to flow more smoothly. And of course, when we're talking about medical products and medical devices, which are produced in many different economies across value chains, allowing for smooth trade and functioning of those supply chains is so important for health and for access to medical devices and the latest technologies. So I'm going to walk through in a bit more detail with you in this presentation three disciplines which I think are important to highlight for national regulatory authorities in this area. The first will be a little bit more on international standards first. Then I want to talk about some of the tools and disciplines in the TBT agreement, which are about encouraging regulatory cooperation and coherence, and why that is also very important. And then finally, I want to touch on transparency and the notification process, and a tool that we have called ePing, which can be a very helpful resource for NRAs as well. So to first touch on the topic of international standards, as I was saying at the outset, the TBT agreement sits at the center of this relationship between what regulators and governments do at the national level in terms of their domestic standards, their domestic regulations, then the link to international trade as well, and international standards. And so the idea, of course, at its core, the TBT agreement is really about pushing countries to align wherever possible their national requirements, their national standards and regulations in favor of international standards. So using as much as possible those international standards. And that, of course, has many different benefits, but in the trade context, and when we're talking about WTO, we're of course focused on trade, that has a very strong trade facilitating element. Of course, it also then is important when we talk about achieving health objectives and protecting health as well. So the discipline, when we look at it in a bit more detail in the TBT agreement, it talks about members of the WTO. So those are 164 different members. They shall use the relevant international standards as the basis for their domestic regulatory structures and standards. So in the TBT agreement, we talk about the technical regulations, which are product requirements that are mandatory. We talk about also conformity assessment procedures. And so these are all of the verification, certification, testing, etc., all of those types of procedures that are used to check that products comply. And so those, as well as national standards, need to be aligned with the relevant international standards. And that's the sort of basic rule. There is, of course, situations where the international standards may not be appropriate or effective for certain economies or regions, for example, for climatic reasons or different technological reasons, or for developing countries as well. There may be situations where they cannot use the international standards, but the basic logic is that we align to the international standards. And that's a very important fundamental principle of the TBT agreement. And I think that wraps up sort of this first part, and that I think is very important to keep in mind. Maybe one thing to point out here also is that when we talk about international standards, we don't, in the TBT agreement, specify standards coming from certain organizations. There are, of course, many different organizations that may be setting international standards in this area. You might think of, for example, WHO may have standards that are relevant, ISO may have standards that are relevant, and other organizations as well. So there can be a wide range of organizations. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. In a sector like medical devices, where technology moves so quickly, you will need to have may need to have many different international standards and sources of standards to help keep up with technology and ensure that trade can flow smoothly. When we look at the second, turning now to the second sort of core set of disciplines that I wanted to highlight, and these are around the importance of regulatory cooperation and coherence. And I think here, the basic idea is that when governments in different places around the world, economies in different places around the world, regulate for the same product, they sometimes may just do it in ways which are different, without knowing it, without realizing that they've diverged from an approach taken in one country. So countries can take very many different approaches, and when there is these differences, of course, can make it very costly and difficult for products to move from one country to another. So I think the idea here when we talk about regulatory cooperation is, how can we encourage economies to talk to each other and to find that common ground so that those unnecessary differences can be either overcome or addressed, or at least dialogue can be promoted to understand the differences, to eventually make it easier for essential products like medical devices to flow more smoothly from country to country, from economy to economy, and to lower the costs of bringing innovative products into a wide range of markets. So, for instance, one of the things that is in the TBT agreement is an idea that WTO members should recognize the results of conformity assessment, which are carried out in other members. So this means that products don't always need to be retested. We don't need to, have another registration process. If you can rely on what's been done in another economy, if you can trust the results coming from another regulatory authority, there's a strong encouragement to do so, to avoid this duplication. So that's one very important aspect. And here maybe just to mention that also there are different ways of doing this. So there are, for example, international systems for accreditation. That's one form. The TBT agreement also talks about the possibility to negotiate mutual recognition agreements, which are also sometimes used in the area of medical products as well, as a means to do this. In addition, I just wanted to make a mention of the fact that we also have an encouragement to rely on the international systems for conformity assessment and regional systems as well, where they exist. Again, because these can avoid this duplication, reduce the time to market for these life-saving products. And I think overall, when we talk about regulatory cooperation and the link to trade, I think it's important to really recognize the benefits of regulatory cooperation and reliance tools from both a trade perspective and, importantly, a health perspective. I think when we talk about reliance regulatory cooperation, this helps to avoid duplication and promotes efficiency, both regulators from the regulatory point of view and also for the manufacturers, so that really the resources can be used most efficiently and to target the risks which are most important. So when we can try to find ways to narrow those unnecessary differences in regulation between different economies, that can actually have benefits for both trade and health in terms of allowing products to be registered more quickly, to allow supply chains to be more resilient in times of crisis in particular. And we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic that the regulatory cooperation structures that were put in place and the arrangements that existed were relied upon in new ways and increasingly so by regulators. And I think that just shows you that these are very valuable tools and something that are worth investing in. I think also it's important to mention that when we think about the NRAs with less resources, not the very big economies, but the smaller NRAs, this type of regulatory cooperation can be very important and very valuable for them, because they have to deal with increasingly complex applications, products, and all the technologies which we see in medical devices today. So I think when we talk about also the link here to good regulatory practices, and my colleague Renee from the USTR will speak about this in more detail after me, I understand. But just to say that, of course, regulatory cooperation also can help strengthen the use of GRPs across economies. And that's of course, very important. And the TBT agreement is also very much pushing in the direction of the use of good regulatory practice. The third area that I wanted to highlight is on transparency. When we talk about transparency here, I think what comes to mind for most people is the notification process. And that's when we talk about the TBT agreement, and also we have the SPS agreement at the WTO, there is a very active and dynamic transparency process whereby members notify their draft regulations through the WTO, and then these are disseminated for a kind of global public consultation process whereby all members of the WTO and other stakeholders as well can provide comments on those draft regulations. There are also a number of other very important transparency obligations. For example, the system of TBT inquiry points is something that is, I think, very important and useful to keep in mind, and helps to allow that information flow between members, between the private sector and governments to take place in an efficient manner. Just to zoom in on the notification process, when governments and their regulators, including NRAs dealing with medical devices, when you are developing new technical regulations or conformity assessment procedures, or if you're changing your existing ones, and these are not based on international standards, and they may have a significant effect on trade, these need to be notified to the WTO. And so the notification process is actually, so this, it's a simple process, and you're reaching out to your colleagues in government who are dealing with trade in the WTO or the TBT agreement. Often the standards body or national standards body can help guide you more on that notification process. But it should be seen, I think, as a very positive thing, the notification process, because it allows you to get free advice, to have a number of extra sets of eyes read through your draft regulation and let you know if there might be potential issues, or maybe there are ways you can clarify your regulation or your proposal. So it's a valuable process that helps also improve the overall quality of your final regulation and make the implementation more efficient. If we look at notifications submitted by WTO members that are related to medical devices per year, we see that they've gone up in recent years. In particular, there have been a number of COVID-19 related notifications that were taken by WTO members, also on an emergency basis. So expedited registration, facilitated registration processes, that type of thing, to deal with that health emergency. But we do see a trend of growing notifications overall across all products, but also when we look at the area of medical devices. And so this is positive, and we hope to encourage members to continue to notify their draft and modified technical regulations and conformity assessment procedures on medical devices. We have a platform called ePing, and if you can see the logo in the top left-hand corner of my screen there, but if you just type into Google EPING, ePing, you'll find it. And this platform is the place really where you can find out everything about TBT notifications. You can search for them, and also here is where you can register to receive alerts also on TBT notifications that may be of interest to you. So if you are an NRA in one WTO member or one economy, and you want to find out what other members are notifying in the products that you are dealing with, you could sign up to ePing, and those notifications would come directly into your inbox. Of course, this tool is very useful for the private sector, and we have quite a number of tens of thousands of subscribers, many of which are in the private sector as well. So that, again, to encourage you to make use of this platform and to follow the notifications and find out more through this system. Finally, just to wrap up, we also have the TBT committee, the WTO TBT committee, which will be meeting, in fact, next week for its regular spring meetings. So there's a week-long set of meetings. And the WTO TBT committee is the place where all of our members come together and try to improve the implementation of the agreement. So a lot of that is around discussing certain specific measures, so what we call the specific trade concerns, most of which are actually measures that have been notified. And so the committee will spend around 2 days of this week discussing those trade concerns and exchanging, dialoguing at a technical level. It's not a legal process. It's much more collegial, technical, trying to find, clarify and provide information about potential trade barriers that are arising from different regulatory approaches. The other very important part of what's going on in the TBT committee, and this actually has two prongs. One is that we talk about, members come together and also discuss on very specific products or sectors or issues, how they're doing, how they work, what issues they're dealing with. So for instance, a few years ago, right before the COVID-19 pandemic, we held one of those type workshop thematic sessions on medical devices, where we had a very good exchange about all the different regulatory approaches of members and the frameworks for cooperation that exist. Next week, we'll be talking about climate change regulation as well as plastic regulation, so an environment focus as well. Another part of this work is the ongoing policy type work of the TBT committee to develop decisions, recommendations, and guidelines that help guide members in how they actually put the agreement into practice. And that's developed over based on members' interest, proposals, and their engagement over time. So to wrap up my presentation, I talked about 3 of the core TBT obligations that I think are of particular relevance to NRAs. The first one was on the importance of international standards and aligning to international standards as the basis for your regulations and your medical device regulations, both in terms of facilitating trade, but also enabling you to also fulfill your mandate and achieve your health protection objectives. We also talked about the tools that exist for regulatory cooperation and coherence and why those are so valuable as well, and the link to good regulatory practice. And then last, I spoke just now about transparency, the notification process, and also the e-ping platform, which we very much encourage you to use and to engage with. So with that, I would just say thank you so much again for the opportunity. And I would very much welcome any comments or questions that you may have. Unfortunately, I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person at this time. But if there are any issues that come up, I'm happy to follow up also by email. And the organizers of the event also, of course, will let me know, and I'll follow up with you if there's anything. So thank you again very much. And I wish you a good rest of your discussion.
Thank you for the attention to this recorded message, which I think it was very, very important because it brought the main issues that we're going to discuss further in this panel that deals with good regulatory practice and international rules. So right now I'm going to call Renee Hencher to keep further the discussion. As it was mentioned before, Renee Hencher is the Director of Regulatory Policies at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. Welcome. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure, Renee, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina, and hello to everyone. It's wonderful to be with all of you. I've worked with the ASEAN Consultative Committee on Standards and Quality over the years in my previous work at the Department of Commerce, and still now while I work at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where I primarily focus on good regulatory practices in U.S. trade agreements, but I also participate in the WTO TBT Committee, focusing on transparency and good regulatory practices with my colleague Jennifer Stratman. And I was able to connect with Devin McDaniel last week. We were both at the same set of meetings, and so I promise we won't overlap too much with respect to our presentations. We tried to work that out. I thank the organizers as well for inviting me to be part of this program. And so as you've started to see, there's a very close relationship between good regulatory practices and the WTO technical barriers to trade agreement. Sometimes we question which came first, really, the TBT obligations or the good regulatory practice obligations. The TBT agreement, it has been in existence since 1995. Good regulatory practice obligations, concepts, principles have evolved over time. There's been a lot of work done in various fora, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which issued the 2012 recommendations on regulatory policy and guidance. And so there's a lot of literature out there. I also know certainly that ASEAN has its good regulatory practice guide. So the work is widespread with respect to good regulatory practices. And so I'm just going to give you a very high level overview in the short time that I have. So regulations are the rules that govern the everyday life of business and citizens, and they're important, as noted, for ensuring public health, safety, and environmental protection, while also promoting economic growth and other policy objectives. So there's no disputing that government has the legitimate right to regulate to achieve public policy objectives, but there are challenges today in our globalized world with interconnected supply chains, and regulatory decisions are no longer purely domestic. And so it's important to acknowledge that regulatory divergences have real costs, and that it's important to look broadly when regulating, to look at what else has been done by other economies, and to rely on international best practices. So I'm just going to talk at the beginning about what are good regulatory practices, and I'm not ready for my first slide yet. I'm just going to sort of introduce the concept that good regulatory practices are the rules for rulemaking, right? They're how governments develop processes, procedures, and mechanisms to throughout the whole life cycle of regulation. There's three really fundamental good regulatory practices. One is public consultation, another is internal coordination, and a third is relying on the best available science, evidence, and data for high quality decision making. There are other good regulatory practices too, such as forward regulatory planning and ex post review of regulations, things like that. But really, those with respect to coordination and public consultation and transparency and information are really the most critical ones, and perhaps most relevant for our conversation today. So it's not enough that these ideas about good regulatory practices exist or are thought about. They need to be put into practice through the development of society's laws, and as well as rules and guidance for regulators, so that they know how to apply these practices. And when that happens, there's greater predictability and consistency about regulatory requirements that are beneficial for citizens, traders, and investors. So now if I can just have the first slide, that would be great. So with respect to, we need to go back one slide. This is the second slide. I need the first slide. So good regulatory practices, again, they're a whole of government approach to regulation. So they apply across the whole central level of government, and they are supposed to be used by all at the central level of government. So all regulators are supposed to use the same practices and follow the same guidance. Good regulatory practices are not about specific technical regulations or any other kind of regulation. They're really those high-level concepts, but they do apply broadly to all regulations. So we're not differentiating between regulation of a particular good, like medical devices, or the regulation of a technology such as nanotechnology. The rules should be the same in terms of how the regulators approach the rulemaking process in all cases. And it's about having a commitment to this good process for setting these requirements. And so what are the benefits when you have these good regulatory practices applied? Well, transparency is the fundamental. A lot of good regulatory practices about transparency, which we'll explore in a moment. It's also about providing confidence and predictability. So citizens know where to go to find information about draft regulations. Traders know where to go to find out about regulations. It's clear what the rules are that they need to comply with. These kinds of things build stability and predictability. It's also beneficial that these practices, that there's inclusivity, because knowledge is sort of almost infinite, and the answers, the data can come from almost anywhere. So in terms of consulting and engaging and seeking out information as regulations are being developed, it's important to be as inclusive as possible. And as I noted, issues in one economy can have impact across the globe, and they can certainly impact global supply chains. Finally, we also think it's very important that good regulatory practices provide that accountability, the transparency into the decision-making process, so that it's understood how a regulatory decision was made. All these things help to build confidence in government and trust by citizens and traders that the rules are being applied fairly and uniformly. So then now to the next slide. I wanted to talk about good regulatory practices as they relate to the TBT agreement. My colleague Devin McDaniel's given you a great overview. I wanted to focus on a couple of these, and you can certainly see these parallels between the broad GRPs and what is discussed in the WTO and what's contained in the TBT agreement. The TBT agreement the emphasis is on ensuring that technical regulations are no more trade restrictive than necessary, and that these disciplines, apply to the development of technical regulations, many of which are for medical technologies. We often find that there might be a misunderstanding that these rules only apply to the trade ministry or other ministries, but they don't. They actually apply to all regulatory authorities within an economy. And most, at the top again is transparency with respect to the development of regulations, and that means providing early notice about planned actions that may happen through the publication of a forward regulatory plan or agenda that gives early information to those that might be affected by a proposed measure, early awareness that something's coming. It's also extremely important to ensure that there's adequate time for interested persons to comment on draft regulations. In the TBT agreement, the baseline is 60 days because there might be an issue with translation of regulation. If it's an industry group, they need time to consult with their members to develop a common position. So timely notice, adequate time to allow those that might be affected by a regulation to provide their input to the regulators who are working on the regulation. And then it's not enough to just provide that time, but it's also essential, and the TBT agreement talks about taking that input into account, that those comments need to be considered, and that those comments should inform the ultimate decision that's taken by the regulator. It's also important to have review and revision of regulations. This might be because there's technology changes or a new standard that's been developed, or maybe there's other information that was not known at the time that the original regulation was issued. So there should really be an opportunity to go back and have a mechanism for review and potential revision of the regulation. That may be, there's different ways that it can be done, but it's really extremely helpful, and it's an acknowledgement that technology is continually evolving and things can change, but also that new information should be relevant to regulatory action. I just note too, with respect to the development of regulations, as Devin noted, there's a lot of notification of regulations relevant to medical technology that have been growing over the years. This makes sense because medical technology is one of the most highly regulated areas. And so certainly it's important for WTO members to be transparent and provide that notice, that information, that notification to trading partners so that they can be aware of those changes, and so that they're that the members of the citizens of those members are also aware. Notifications aren't just for the economies, they're also for the citizens of the economies. With respect to coordination, this is something that to help make sure that there's not overlap or duplication for redundancy with respect to measures that are being proposed. Coordination is also important because there may be, different ministries that have different responsibilities with respect to a draft regulation, and it can be confusing to understand who's the most accountable party. Also, there's benefits. There's a need for coordination between the regulators and the inquiry point. As was noted, each economy has an obligation with respect to transparency to provide an inquiry point that provides these notifications and receives input from other WTO members. That inquiry point may be in a national standards body, it might be in a trade ministry, it might be someplace else. Oftentimes, there's not good communication and coordination between those different parts of a government to make sure that all measures are properly notified. But coordination is really very, very important. And then international standards. The fundamental document that the TBT agreement has issued with respect to international standards is the 2000 decision on the use of international standards, guides, and recommendations. And so members are supposed to use relevant international standards where they exist and where they're fit for purpose. They're supposed to notify if they're not using an international standard. But it's important to remember that 2000 decision, the title is not just international standards, it's use of international standards, guides, and recommendations, and those certainly exist in the medical technology space. So there's lots of resources that economies should look to as they begin to regulate in this space. And then finally, with respect to regulatory cooperation and reliance, I think Devin covered a lot of this space. One thing I wanted to note was that we definitely believe that applying these good regulatory practices, the coordination, the transparency, the public consultation, the use of best available high quality information, you need to have those foundational practices in order for regulatory cooperation to truly work between different economies. And there are many opportunities to rely upon international systems of conformity assessment, international standards, even to share inspections or cooperate in market surveillance, those kinds of reliance activities that can be beneficial in regulators using the scarce resources they have to regulate most effectively. The other thing I wanted to mention was that the WTO TBT committee is currently in the process of developing guidance for regulators on conformity assessment, and hopefully we'll get that work done sometime this year. But I think that's going to be helpful in terms of providing some guidance on, risk and also use of different technologies and different types of conformity assessment procedures. And hopefully you will be seeing that guidance come out relatively soon. With that, I will thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to engage in the Q&A session that follows. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you for your presentation. I think that's very good for our Q&A. We have a couple of questions already, and I'm inviting all participants right now to bring questions that we might address for you. So I think I will begin with the first two questions that I have here, Renee. And the first one is more a comment, but I think it's a good comment for us to touch upon, which is the connection between the ISO and its proactivity in terms of bringing technical rules and how to engage the ISO with the WTO rules and the WTO members in terms of transparency. I think that's a very, very important issue because the ISO standards are actually the international part of also the international standards brought by the TBT agreement. So addressing a little bit of this relation between the two, I think that could be very interesting. And if I can jump into the second question, and then maybe we can go into both of them. I don't know, is this okay for you, or would you like to address this first? Yeah, okay. So the second one would be related more with the US practice. So the comment is that the Federal Register, when it brings like a draft in a public consultation requesting comments, that would be a very good practice. And sometimes that's not so easy to see in other countries with limited resources and national authorities that have to deal with so many issues at the same time. But we are in an electronic age, that's the comment. So how can we make this a little bit more practical, or what piece of advice we could bring in order to make the public consultations more accessible in other countries?
So thank you. With respect to the first question, the International Organization for Standardization. So ISO is an observer in the WTO TBT committee. They always provide an update on their practices at each meeting. And also they are they follow the code of good practice with respect to the development of standards that's part of the TBT agreement. So as I talked about, there's certain processes that standards developers should follow, right, in terms of providing transparency about their practices and balance and relevance, et cetera. And so certainly organizations like ISO and IEC do emphasize that with respect to the development of their standards. There's other standards development organizations as well that exist in this space that also follow those procedures and do develop standards that might be relevant in the medical technology space. As I mentioned, there's the TBT agreement emphasizes the use of relevant international standards, but the agreement doesn't name bodies, right? So it's always important to note it's the process that's used to develop the standards, that it's open, that it's balanced, that there's coherence, that there's effectiveness, so that those principles are what underpin what's important with respect to the development of international standards. That said, I know that there are a lot of ISO standards that are used in this sector, but there's others as well. With regard to question number 2 on U.S. practice, yes, we do have the Federal Register, which is online. It's also possible to go to regulations.gov, which is essentially the one-stop shop that the United States has where you can find draft regulations that are open for public comment. So we are using the technology with sort of a single portal concept to make it as easy as possible for everyone to know where to go. So remember, I was talking about making it easy for traders and citizens to know where to go to find out about draft measures. Well, having like a central portal is an evolving best practice, and many economies are starting to have that. That said, we know that takes resources. So often draft regulations will be posted on the website of the relevant ministry. And so it's often necessary to go to each website to look for that. But at minimum, really, those information about drafts should be posted on a specific health ministry or whatever's website. But if there is if there is if it's possible to connect that to sort of a central portal, that's really ideal, or to link up websites so it's as easy as possible to find this kind of information. The United States, I mean, we're continuing to evolve our practices in this area. I mean, we're moving more and more towards everything being posted online. We think it's very important for agencies to post their procedures so that there can be a petition, appeal if there's an issue with the regulation, as I talked about, and a party would like to say, okay, I have new information. There's another standard you could consider. All that information about how to do that should be on agency websites, as well as information on their statutory authorities, their legal obligations, anything, compliance documents that might be necessary, all those kinds of things. As much as can be put online as possible can be very valuable. And also, it's important to remember, I mean, in this sector, there's a lot of small and medium enterprises, and this kind of transparency and online access is particularly beneficial for small and medium enterprises. Of course, I know there's lots in the ASEAN region as well.
I think there's also a question here for you, and the question is saying, is 60 days enough? Should we have more than that, like 90 days, in commenting a regulation? And would you like to go into this a little bit?
Yes, so 60 days is the recommendation for the TVT committee. There is no requirement that, I mean, it's certainly great to provide more time. U.S. regulators often provide 90 days, or if it's an extremely complex measure, it might be 120 or 180 days for comment and consideration. Sometimes something is posted for comment and maybe there weren't a lot of comments received, or the comments, the volume of comments indicates that this issue is particularly, significant. And so then it might be, think about extending the comment deadline. There's nothing that restricts an economy from providing more time. What we often find, though, is there's not enough time, right? So 15 days is often the case, or 30 days. And as I mentioned, it takes time with the translation. It takes time to review those comments. You may not see it the first day that it pops up, right? And then you miss time to respond that way as well. So longer is better, and preferable.
And sometimes it's so complex that you need time to understand everything that it's coming with the regulation, right? So I think 60 days should be the minimum, maybe, and then if possible, we can make it bigger. So there's a question here saying the ASEAN Medical Device Directive states that there should be conformity assessment, but does not specify how to achieve this objective. Are there some best practices from the guidance related to conformity assessment that can be previewed for this audience to hopefully be published later in 2023?
Yeah, I guess I'd just say I can't really, the document's so restricted, so I can't really speak to that. But there's resources. There were all the international standards that ISO and IEC developed that we call the Casco Toolbox, the guidance for conformity assessment bodies on their practices, the guidance for accreditation. All of that is fundamental. It's widely recognized. You can also go to, when you look at the WTO website, you'll see one of the things that Devin mentioned is all these examples of conformity assessment approaches that can be taken. So that all comes from this, it's called the indicative list of conformity assessment procedures that the committee developed some time ago. So that provides some of those examples as well. In the United States, we, our regulators also rely on our National Institute of Standards and Technology as an expert to guide them in the development of conformity assessment procedures. So I don't know if there's certainly every economy that's participating in this workshop has a national standards body, they have an accreditation body, and those can be resources as well for the regulators to work with. We often find that there's not enough engagement between those various bodies, right? And I think that there's work that needs to be done. We talked about the lack of coordination between regulators and trade officials, but there also needs to be improved coordination between the standards and conformance experts in an economy with the regulatory authorities to make sure it all works together. A criticism I often hear is that the regulatory authority does not really give enough time for the say the conformity assessment bodies to become expert in the evaluation that they need to perform, right? There's not that thought that's put into having that engagement and making sure that there's a transition period, that there's capacity building in terms of training that takes place. Because, a lot of times the issue with conformity assessment with some technical regulations is there aren't enough conformity assessment bodies, or they don't know how to do the testing or the evaluation. So all these, there needs to be that integration. The other thing is in the Asia Pacific region, there are expert bodies like the Pacific Area Standards Congress and the Pacific Accreditation Cooperation. We call them the specialist regional bodies that are also a resource for all the economies in the region to work with on various, some of these elements.
And I think it's worth mentioning maybe what Stephen Bipes mentioned at the beginning with the checklist that the medical device regional convergence is trying to bring together in terms of helping implementing technical regulations and conformity assessment. I think that's a very interesting connection between the principles and the implementation period and work that the national authorities have. So I think it's very interesting to have this kind of exercise or tool where we have the answer, and the question is going to guide you through the compliance of the rules and the technical regulations and the conformity assessment that you have. So I think that's one possible way of doing it. There's a question here a little bit different from what we are approaching here, which is how the international organization should also practice and abide to good regulatory practice. And I think that's the example that we're bringing it here with the World Trade Organization, bringing these rules. Do you want to comment a little bit on that, Renee, or should I go to Devin maybe afterwards?
I guess I just say that, yeah, certainly we think that that international organizations should follow these kinds of best practices too. If they put if they're developing a guidance document, they should put it out for public consultation. That they should allow input from the relevant stakeholders. That's not always the case. So yes, you can sort of think of these international organizations as needing to also apply good regulatory practices. We try internally in the United States when we're doing these, to work together, to coordinate, to consult, to make sure we're complying with all of our obligations. It's just, yeah. So I just say that it's ideally something that is desirable. I know that there's work in the OECD with different international organizations to try to focus on improving their good, their practices with respect to how they're operating. We're talking about standards and standards bodies, conformity assessment bodies. Certainly, like the Code of Good Practices, there's a lot of similarities between the development of standards and development of regulations in terms of these concepts of having broad participation and transparency and things. And that could be applied to it should be considered by other organizations as well.
It's like one rule that fits all: private sector, national authorities, and international organizations, and we should all comply with it. With that in mind, I think we are having the time on spot for our panel. I would like to thank you so much, Renee, for being available for this Q&A. And I know it was all on you because Devin was not here, but I think it was very, very good. And I hope to have you in other workshops that we are doing it across the globe. And I am always available to other questions that might arise as well during this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina and Renee, and Devin, who kindly pre-recorded his presentation. So that session was a great introduction to GRPs as we move into our next panel on global frameworks for regulation of medical devices. But first, we'll have a quick break so you can stretch your legs. I have right now, 10:22. So let's reconvene in about 8 minutes. That'll be 10:30 Jakarta time. So see everyone in a bit. Right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. Let's get right to it. We're moving on now to the session on global frameworks for regulation of medical devices, which will discuss frameworks promoting medical device convergence and interpreting and aligning them with national regulations. We have Sandra Liga Gonzalez, our MDRC lead for medical devices, moderating this session, along with panelists Tracy Duffy, First Assistant Secretary, Medical Devices and Product Quality from Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration, Eka Purnamasari, Director, Medical Device Supervision from Indonesia's Ministry of Health, Tammy Stierwald, Global Head of Regulatory Policy from Roche Diagnostics, and I understand Agnes from World Health Organization has got a pre-recorded presentation as well. So Sandra, over to you for this session and the next. Thank you.
Have a wealth of knowledge being shared with all the attendees today. And as Mugan was mentioning this time, but she with message. So we will get started with her. The message is a little bit longer as compared to the initial time we have assigned. So we will be making the necessary adjustments while the Q&A. And still, we would really like for you to capture your questions in the Q&A feature. May we forward them to Agnes for her to properly address them in a written manner. So if we can have the technical team helping us running Agnes pre-recorded message, we'll appreciate it. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues and friends. My name is Agnes Sitakijo. I work at the WHO headquarters as a technical officer under a unit called Regulation and Safety in a specific team called Facilitated Product Introduction Team. It's a great honor and pleasure to be invited to speak to you during this regional workshop on good regulatory practices and medical devices regulation. So my presentation today is going to be very brief to update you on the revision of the global model regulatory framework, but also touch on the specificities or to touch on aspects in relation to good regulatory practices and good reliance practices in terms of how they have been embedded within the revised version of the global model regulatory framework. So just to begin with the introductory slide to speak a little bit on why we needed to revise and update the Global Model Regulatory Framework. So this is a document which was in existence since 2017, and so the initiation to develop started around 2015 to 2016. So you can imagine that this document has been in existence at least for about 7 years. And so what triggered the revision and update of the Global Model Regulatory Framework was the fact that this field is rapidly changing. Technologies are advancing in terms of their nature and complexities. We are learning these days about how popular software as medical devices is becoming, issues around artificial intelligence, and etc. And so we also realize that there has been documents that have been developed by WHO within the 7 years timeline, and especially in 2021, where WHO developed 3 important guidance documents, or updated 3 important guidance documents, including a guidance document on post-market surveillance and market surveillance. I think you're going to hear about this more from my colleague Anita Sands tomorrow, but also publication of a good reliance practices guidance document and a guidance on good regulatory practices. But we recently had a very interesting discussion while developing indicators for the assessment of regulatory systems through the global benchmarking tool. So during these discussions, we realized that there was a need to update the global model regulatory framework to catch up with the current trend. The experience in implementation, of course, and the challenges experienced by regulators during the COVID-19 pandemic were also some of the triggers for the revision, but also routine use, day-to-day use of the global model regulatory framework. As mentioned previously, that the document had already been in existence for 7 years, so it needed to be updated. So these are some of the triggers for WHO to embark into this exercise to review the global model regulatory framework. I wanted to project this particular slide so that you can see the relationship between the WHO important tools, but also how it has addressed all these important documents have addressed principles and the concepts of both good reliance practices and good regulatory practices. So within the global model regulatory framework, which is like a mother document, so in this particular document, there are recommendations on how countries, for example, can introduce systems on post-market and market surveillance for medical devices, including in vitro diagnostics. But then all other elements and concepts that are within the good regulatory practices and good reliance practices are also part and parcel of the global model regulatory framework. And so, as I mentioned previously, during development of the GBT plus medical devices, it borrowed the ideas and the concepts and the recommendations of the global model regulatory framework. And so the sub-indicators that speaks to regulation of medical devices and IVDs have been borrowed from the global model regulatory framework. But at the same time, the guidance for post-market and market surveillance document was also a resource document while defining the sub-indicators or indicators which are specific on post-market and market surveillance guidance documents. And so you can see there is a lot of similarities in terms of the different concepts that are being promoted by WHO. But overall, in all these 3 important tools, all the concepts of good reliance practices and good regulatory practices have been addressed. And so there is a lot of similarities in terms of how we are advocating use of the good reliance practices and good regulatory practices between all the 3 important guidance documents. I have provided specific links for all these important tool for your own, for ease of reference after the workshop. So very briefly, I'm going to describe to you the methodology that was used during the revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework, but also the experts that were involved during the 13 meetings of the discussions of the working group. So in terms of the methodology, we established a group of experts, which we called it GMRF Working Group. So in this group, we involved mostly national regulatory authorities experts all over the world, and also product-specific experts, understanding the complexities of medical devices and IVDs. And so we ended up on having 47 NRIs participating consistently during the discussions of the revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. But also we were very happy to have on board, for example, international harmonization initiatives, such as a representative from the IMDRF, the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. We also had a representative from the Global Harmonization Working Party. We had a representative from the African Medical Devices Forum, but also West African Health Organization was represented. So in terms of understanding the contribution of individual national regulatory authorities, but also the international harmonization initiatives, these were the groups that participated during the discussion. And I think it is important at this point to mention that WHO works very, very closely with all important stakeholders, including international harmonization initiative groups such as the IMDRF, GHWP, and AMDF in our day-to-day activities in terms of emphasizing on the need to and follow up to make sure that requirements and standards and the concepts are harmonized throughout the different regional harmonization initiatives. And so this is why it was very, very important that all these important groups are part and parcel of the discussions of the during the revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. In terms of the timelines, and I'm not going to speak about, because you're going to have this presentation to read afterwards. So we expect, after a lengthy discussion from September 2021, the final draft Global Model Regulatory Framework was finalized in September 2022 and submitted to the internal expert committee, which is called the Expert Committee on Biological Standardization, which discussed the draft document in October 2022 and endorsed it for publication. But the actual publication is expected to happen during the 2023 World Health Assembly, which is expected to take place in May. And so you'd find some time to go through these different stages that we went through during the revision of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. So at the moment, this is how the table of content of the new Global Model Regulatory Framework looks like. It has 7 chapters with 2 new additional chapters as compared to the version that existed in 2017. So very briefly, in chapter 2, where it reads definition, classification, essential principles, and conformity assessment of medical devices, these are the major changes that happened. So we have included a text on companion diagnostics, but also moved the companion diagnostics from chapter 2 to chapter 6, where the text has been expanded. But we also revised and aligned the definition of some of the terminologies which have been updated in the IMDRF guidance document. For example, the definition for medical devices and the definition on adverse event. But on specific text of chapter 2, we have also polished and included also some further clarification so that the text is clearer as compared to the version of 2017. So coming to chapter 3, which is titled Enabling Conditions for Effective Regulation of Medical Devices, including in vitro diagnostics, this is where it touches really the core discussion or the core theme for this workshop, because it speaks on enabling conditions for effective regulation of these products, which also touches some of the foundational concepts and foundational issues that would enable maturity, would enable growth, would enable stability of the regulatory systems for medical devices and IVDs. And in this chapter, that's where the concept of good regulatory practice and good reliance practices is explained. But I also wanted to mention that throughout the global model regulatory framework, in each of the chapters that have been introduced in the global model regulatory framework. So if you talk about, for example, companion diagnostics, if you talk about the regulatory pathways, if you talk about reprocessing of medical devices, if you talk about donation, many of these chapters we have tried as much as possible to introduce elements on good regulatory practices and good reliance practices. So you'll see that these elements are repeating in many chapters within the global model regulatory framework, including also testing laboratories, etc. So this is a concept that has been, these two concepts have been made explicit throughout the global model regulatory framework as compared to the version of 2017. And just to speak briefly about the good regulatory practice, so it provides very high level principles, which are 9 principles applicable to all authorities responsible for regulating medical products in general, but also medical devices, including IVDs, irrespective of their maturity or resources that they have, so that regulators can establish a regulatory system which is sound, which is science-based, affordable, and responsive, especially during public health emergencies. But the principles are actually supposed to serve as a benchmark and thereby assist member states in the application of good practices, which would create a good foundation for introducing reliance and recognition elements. So if authorities work towards the same standard and in a similar way with the same requirements, then trust can be built and NRAs will engage more on collaborative work such as work sharing, joint assessment, and of course reliance. And this is why WHO has been making a lot of effort in advocating on convergence, such that national regulatory authorities can be able to understand the requirements of the other national regulatory authority, and through trust they can be able to engage in different collaborative work. So very, very important that we are all geared towards good regulatory practices, but we are geared towards convergence and harmonizing requirements and standards that are used by the different national regulatory authorities globally. But speaking about the good reliance practices, we all understand. I think this is not the first time that we are hearing about reliance, but this is when a regulatory authority in one country takes into account and gives significant weight to assessment performed by another regulatory authority or trusted institution such as WHO, or to any other authoritative information in reaching its own decision. So it involves exchange of information, which is assessed in an abbreviated manner with the relying national regulatory authorities before making their own decision on whether to accept this product or to reject. But I think this is also a way of what we call these days smart regulation. So you make best use of available resources and expertise to avoid duplication and concentrate on regulatory efforts and resources where most needed. For example, there are some of the activities that cannot be outsourced. For example, inspection of your own local establishments, post-market surveillance, market surveillance, vigilance activities. These are some of the activities that it may be difficult to outsource or to let another national regulatory authority to do it for you. So very, very important that instead of delaying and duplicating activities, it's important that you adopt smart regulation by leveraging on the information that is submitted by another or is shared by another national regulatory authority, and then focus on the work that cannot be outsourced. So there is a lot of good regulatory practices and good reliance practices in this particular chapter. And so this particular slide, I've borrowed this photo from the Good Regulatory Practices Guidance document, but really this is to explain how the Global Model Regulatory Framework has taken into consideration all these good reliance practices, good regulatory practices principles, but also the concept and principles of the GRP are mentioned here: legality, consistency, independency, impartiality, proportionality, flexibility, clarity, efficiency, and transparency. So they apply to the overall regulatory system. When we say regulatory system, it covers the regulatory framework. So we expect these principles to apply in the regulatory framework, institutions involved in the regulatory work, and also the resources allocated for application and implementation of good regulatory practices to be effective. We have also included several enablers that supports the implementation of the good regulatory practices principles. And so the Global Model Regulatory Framework has also addressed some of the good regulatory principles and enabler on specific places of the text of the Global Model Regulatory Framework. For example, issues around legal requirements, which speaks to a principle called legality. So emphasizing that legal requirements should be based on sound legal framework, issues around the funding of regulatory authorities, stakeholders' involvement, which also touches on the issue of clarity and transparency, and of course a bit on efficiency and consistency. We have touched on conflict of interest and impartiality, emphasizing a need for the regulatory authority to work in as much as possible, in a partial way, as much as possible. And then issue around regulatory competencies in resources is focusing more on human resources, understanding that the work of the National Regulatory Authority is very technical, and so you need to have very competent and skilled staff that can be able to undertake the work of the regulatory authority, and then implementation and monitoring. The key concepts on good reliance practices is recognition. It's unilateral or mutual. So there are times where you may take the final decision of another national regulatory authority. Sometimes it can be one way, and in other cases it could be both ways, which is mutual recognition. But the emphasis on good reliance practices concept is a life cycle approach. So it applies across the full cycle of a medical product. And then it is also risk-based and very important for medical devices, understanding that there are different classes of medical devices, and so risk-based approach is very important, so that effort is made to the high risk class of medical devices, but also a source of the product, where this product is sourced. You can also emphasize more effort in places where you may not have information, but also the level of resources and expertise available, but also the performance of the product itself in the market may also determine whether you need to focus more on a specific product or not. And of course, the regional reliance mechanism, we also encourage that individual regions may also embark into a specific regional reliance mechanism. So this is on good reliance practices. I've also attached this particular diagram which speaks to different mechanisms or examples on reliance, but I think key message here is that once you increase reliance in medical, especially in this is relates more on pre-market phase. So when you increase level of reliance, then there is an improved, drastic improvement in terms of the efficiency on the regulatory decision. But I've also provided some of the examples here in terms of what are the other mechanisms that can be used by the or adopted by the National Regulatory Authority to improve efficiency of the National Regulatory Authority. We have examples of the collaborative registration procedure. We have the example of WHO emergency use listing, which also provides platform for national regulatory authorities to leverage on the report that has been developed by the World Health Organization. So on chapter 4, I'm not going to touch on chapter 4, but it speaks more on local production and the issue around regulatory testing. So this is also, the text has been really expanded to emphasize on or discouraging routine testing during pre-market, but also lot verification based on risk assessment. And then on local production, it speaks about a need for technologies transfer, but also consistency of requirements. So it also touches on the principles of good regulatory practices, and then a need to come up with a strategy, government strategy, to support national local production of medical products. I've touched a little bit on this one, so I'm not going to repeat, but you will have all this information in the slide. Under chapter 5, where it reads regulatory pathways, we have included, this is a completely new chapter in the global model regulatory framework, and it speaks about, for example, the first one, regulatory pathway according to risk class. This is where routine assessment is conducted on a technical file, but we have also included another pathway that speaks to reliance. So how are you going to assess, for example, products that have been applied using reliance mechanism? And there are beautiful diagrams that summarizes the process on how to manage the different classes of medical devices, but also on emergency use authorization. So how do you assess the products during emergency situation? Combination products, borderline products, and of course donated medical products. So this also speaks more on good reliance, good regulatory practices concept in terms of clarity, transparency in terms of how the National Regulatory Authority would approach the different types of products, including complicated products such as borderline products, combination products, and in some cases, donated medical devices. This is just photos or pictures of the different regulatory pathways for medical devices during routine assessment, but also using the reliance pathway. On chapter 6 and chapter 7, it speaks on, especially on chapter 6, it speaks, and this is in relation for the topic of today. So we have included, for example, the collaborative registration procedure, which is an example of a reliance mechanism, but also emergency use listing, an extensive text which speaks about the emergency use listing by WHO. And on chapter 7 on implementation, this is purely good regulatory practices. We've included very good text on how to involve stakeholders in the regulatory processes, which is an important part of good regulatory practices. We have also included a very interesting text on how to develop a roadmap, because we were asked by regulators previously that, yes, you may have recommendations on specific regulatory functions, but how do you then start to introduce, when and how do you start to introduce regulatory systems for medical devices? So we've provided some text on systematic planning and follow-up on how to advance the regulatory systems for medical devices, but also on regulatory capacity building, which is also a very important part of good regulatory practice. I think this is my last slide. And so once again, I would like to thank the organizers for providing this platform for WHO to present in this important workshop. And I would be happy to receive questions through email, and I would respond through the organizers so that there is clarity in terms of some of the issues that may not have come out very clearly during my presentation. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best in the remaining sessions of the workshop. Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're running a little bit later as compared to what we were originally planning. So in case you may have any question for Agnes, we'd appreciate if you can capture those in the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome Tracy Duffy, the head of the medical devices in product quality at TGA Australia, and former chair of the IMDRF for the last year. So Tracy, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just making sure everyone can hear me. Excellent.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I think we all recognize the importance of global frameworks, especially for manufacturers that will allow access to a range of markets, and importantly, access to do devices for patients, because that's what we're all here for, access for patients to really groundbreaking devices and in fact, life-saving devices. The aim of regulatory frameworks, just to recap, I think, is to really reduce regulatory burden and costs for manufacturers and the regulator. They can also provide clear and transparent understanding of what the safety, performance and quality and evidence expected of regulators would be. And they can help ensure that the regulatory requirements can keep pace with the changes or innovations or respond to safety concerns. And I guess it's those aims that prompted the Global Harmonisation Task Force, the GHTF, which was the precursor to the IMDRF, to really see the benefits of such frameworks and embark on a journey of developing guidance document that not only the IMDRF or the GHTF countries could use, but to publicly share those so that other countries and regulators could use those as well. So the IMDRF, for those of you who don't know, develop and publish guidance that countries then adopt into their regulatory or legislative frameworks. And we've published over 40 guidances and a lot more to come. Whilst the IMDRF Management Committee has its own membership of certain countries, it's important to note that the working groups that are established by the IMDRF can actually have members from countries outside the IMDRF. And in fact, through their publication of their draft guidance documents, the working groups ask and seek and encourage anyone to provide feedback on those guidances. So they're fit for purpose for countries and manufacturers and regulators, irrespective of whether they are an IMDRF member or not. A challenge, however, in global frameworks is that obviously some countries may have to adopt or adapt them for their own regulatory or legislative frameworks. And in Australia, when we adopt an IMDRF guidance, part of the process is that we do public consultation on that framework to make sure that it's appropriate for the Australian setting. However, in IMDRF, we are also very conscious that we want to reduce the amount of times that countries or other groups or organisations need to adjust or amend the regulatory guidance that is set out by the IMDRF, because it creates confusion and it creates burden because you have to make some changes. An example of where slight changes may impact on cost and burden is, for example, in relation to UDI. Now, the IMDRF Management Committee is acutely aware of some of the slight changes or interpretations of the UDI guidance that is currently being looked at. For example, the data fields, whether it's clinically relevant size or in relation to sterility. So even though there's a global document in a global framework, there is still opportunities to refine it and make more clear the expectations of those frameworks. And as previous speakers have said, public consultation is so important and imperative to the process to develop guidance, and we should encourage everyone to be involved in feeding back on that guidance as it's being developed. Guidance is the critical factor in supporting global frameworks, whether it's an IMDRF guidance document or whether it's used to create and support other frameworks that are being developed by other groups. The guidance is only one thing. The next critical factor, and this is very much the conversation that I led with IMDRF last year, is the interpretation of that guidance. And sometimes there are differences in the interpretation of the guidance that's published. And this has led the IMDRF last year to consider training programs which are under consideration, so that there are training programs that help people who wish to use or adopt the guidance understand and apply the guidance in the way that it was intended to be applied. Also, if the guidance is not clear, it can lead to other organisations or groups or countries taking the guidance and changing it based on their own interpretation or giving it more detail so it actually changes the original intent. And that's another area where the IMDRF is acutely aware of trying to make sure that we can identify areas where we can encourage people to be involved in the early development of guidance so that people don't have to change it later on to suit their own circumstances or if where it's not clear. So it's really important to get that input up front. This instance has also led to the IMDRF looking at disclaimers on the documents to make sure that if the documents are used and if they are reproduced, that they are actually reproduced in the intent and for the purpose that they were used for. And that's really important for a global framework to maintain its, I guess, integrity. Another key consideration is when guidance is needed to better explain or fill in a gap where standards may not be in place, or where the standard may not have kept up to date, or where the standards is out of date because of technological change. And we saw some examples of that, especially during COVID, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But here again, the rate of standards development and the important role that standards play in regulatory decision-making and assessment processes was identified as a critical issue by the IMDRF a couple of years ago, and that led to the creation of the Standards Liaison Program. And there's more information on the IMDRF website about that program. But this is a program whereby the IMDRF representatives can directly engage with the standards organisations in their processes of updating standards to make sure the regulatory perspective is included in their work. In these cases, guidance may be written where there are some issues or gaps with standards. We've seen some cases where guidance might be written by one country and then adopted by another. During COVID, Australia wrote some guidance and a number of checklists associated with face masks and respirators and rapid antigen tests for COVID, and shared this information and put this on our website. And it was seen that other countries, including some other IMDRF members, picked up this information because the existing documentation wasn't granular enough, and there was a gap in what we needed to provide as guidance to the sector who was trying to help the COVID response right around the world. It was also picked up by the WHO. So in closing, because I know we're out of time, Australia is a small regulator, and so we do rely heavily on global frameworks. But obviously, we need to make sure that it is fit for purpose for the Australian environment. We also know that there's new manufacturers entering the markets all the time, and these new manufacturers are not always familiar with regulations, let alone regulations across different countries. So how do we as a group, as an organisation and with partners, assist these manufacturers in understanding the regulatory requirements to get their devices to the patients that need them? We rely in Australia on global frameworks, and we also have a range of recognition programs in place. And some of those are on our website, but mostly it's a recognition of other countries' regulatory approvals, but also our participation in the MDSAP program. I guess the key consideration is to understand and make sure you're aware that you can apply the global framework if there is one, and it's applied consistent with the intent. Be clear where you can't apply it and give the rationale, and get involved. I mean, most of the global frameworks are asking for people to be involved, so it makes the global framework better suited and more useful across countries. And be involved in the public consultations, particularly when IMDRF consultations are released. We really welcome it. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing from my other panel members. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and really very interesting and enlightening the information that you're sharing. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to have a few questions for you during the Q&A session. So thank you very much, and then I'll open the floor for Eka Purnamasari to share with us on your experiences and your perspectives on the global frameworks for medical devices. So thank you very much. The floor is yours, Eka.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay. Good morning, good evening, good night, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, participant of virtual meeting, Global Framework for Regulation of Medical Devices, USAID. My name is Eka Purnamasari. I am a Director for Medical Devices Control, Ministry of Health in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we have two divisions about medical device. The first is Directorate of Production and Distribution Medical Device, which control for pre-market. And the second one is Directorate of Post-Market Control, with me in here, yeah, Directorate for Medical Device Control. With these two directorates, we try to manage to interpret and align national regulation with international guidelines. Next slide. Yeah, Indonesia has cooperation and active participation in regional and global practice, such as AMDD, Asian Medical Device Directive, Global Harmonization Working Parties, WHO, APEC, with Working Area Pre-Market, Post-Market, and Quality Management System, IMDRF, and also with SHARN. With one of working group is medical device and IVD. Yeah, Indonesia has ratified AMDD for medical device classification. Next slide. Risk classification is based on the potency of risk that cause. Based on AMDD, there are 4 classifications for medical devices. That is Class E, medical devices that has low risk in its use. Class B for medical devices that has low until moderate risk on its use. And Class C, medical devices that has moderate until high risk on its use. And Class D, medical devices that has high risk on its use. Next. Based on the law of Republic Indonesia, number 36 year 2009 on health, that medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices that distributed within Indonesia must have a product license. This is to ensure that user can get safely and qualified medical device. In Indonesia, there are we have some regulation beside the regulation of law of Republic of Indonesia for pre-marketing. For pre-market controlling, we have regulation for require a person who is responsible for placing medical device on the market to be licensed. Government regulation number 5 of 2021 on implementation of risk-based business licensing, and regulation of the Minister of Health of the Republic of Indonesia number 15 year 2021 on standard of business activity on the implementation of health sector risk-based business licensing, regulate for production license to manufacture of medicine devices. Also regulate for a distribution license for the distributor of medical devices, and also for register the product and also GMP and GDP. Technical regulation for registration of medical devices product. We have regulation of the Minister of Health of the Republic of Indonesia number 62 year 2017 on marketing license of medical device, in vitro diagnostic medical device, and household product. Technical guide regulation for good manufacturing practice for medical device or GMP. We have regulation of the Minister of Health of Republic of Indonesia number 20 year 2070 on good manufacturing practice for medical devices. And the technical regulation for good distribution practices for medical device, we have regulation of the Minister of Health of Republic of Indonesia number 14 of 2014 on good distribution practice for medical devices. For the post market controlling, we have a regulation, some regulation. There are government regulation number 5 year 2021 on implementation of risk-based business licensing, and regulation of the Minister of Health of Republic of Indonesia number 14 2021 on standard of business activity on implementation of health sector risk-based business licensing. The regulation also regulate for post-market controlling. For technical post-market controlling, we have some guidance, example given guidance for supervision of production facilities of medical devices, guidance for sampling and testing of medical devices, guidance for recalls and disposal of medical devices, and guidance for adverse event investigation of medical devices. Medical device control in Indonesia includes pre-market and post-market control. Pre-market control start from research and development by manufacturer until the product gets a distribution license. In the pre-market manufacturers and distributors are controlled to ensure they are fulfillment of good practice in production and distribution. For production facility, we do control and make sure the manufacturer of medical device must comply with GMP or CPAKB prior to the placement of product on the market. GMP in Indonesia, we call it CPAKB, was adapted from ISO 13485 year 2016 that described the basic principle of applying GMP in facility that produce medical devices. For a GMP guideline in Indonesia, regulated in regulation of Ministry of Health Indonesia number 20 year 2017. It covers several aspects: quality management system, management responsibility, resource management, product realization and measurement, analysis, and improvement. Then for the distributor of medical devices, we make a control to assure that they comply with good distribution practices. Good distribution practices adopted from ISO 9001 2008 that describe the basic principles of applying GDP in a facility that distributes medical devices. Yeah, next. We also have guidelines and Indonesia national standard for medical devices, which harmonize with relevant international standard or adopting international standards such as ISO, IEC, EN, and WHO standard. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eka. I think it was very valuable to learn how things are being done in Indonesia. And I think we will have a couple of questions also for you in a bit. So we will now move then directly to gain knowledge on the perspective of the industry on the global framework. So Tammy, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. With me, please. Can you see my screen?
It should be coming.
Okay, I will wait.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for having me here today and giving me an opportunity to present some industry perspectives. Tammy Stewart-Wald, and I'm with Roche Diagnostics, and I focus on policy work for foundational principles and supranational organizations. Many of you that perhaps have seen me present in the past know this quote, perhaps from a past slide of mine. I still like to use it because I think it really embodies some of what we all experienced when we went through COVID-19. So the quote is, "Don't be afraid of going slow, just be afraid of standing still." I like to use this quote because from many different angles, from a regulator perspective, from industry perspective, from patient perspective, we were all faced with challenges that we had not had to deal with in the past. And so I think it was a good opportunity, and if there could be something positive that emerged from that experience, to see how we could all come together and figure out how to expedite the products that people needed during COVID-19. We did see during COVID-19 that time to diagnosis matters. I have a couple of quotes here for you. I'll just read the first one. "A longer time from symptom onset to confirmed diagnosis yielded a worse COVID-19 prognosis." So we know that we have a sense of urgency when it comes to developing products for patients who need them. We've all been patients in the past. We have parents, siblings, children who need these IVDs and medical devices on a daily basis. So I think it's really important to recognize that that is why we are all here today, as Tracy said, to put our brains together and to find how we can operationalize some of these opportunities to converge on regulatory frameworks. Real quick, I like this visual because it shows us what divergent regulation and convergent regulation look like. So on the left side of your screen, we have a number of bullseyes. So as a manufacturer, we will design products for multiple jurisdictions, and we will make the necessary changes, whether that be in pre-market or post-market, to accommodate jurisdiction-specific requirements. And we will hit that bullseye and maintain compliance compliance to those requirements in order to introduce that product to the market and keep it there. However, you can see the redundancy in that image on the left side, that as a manufacturer, we will go through this exercise over and over again with slight changes, sometimes significant changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction for the same exact product. On the right side of your screen, you see an example of what convergent regulation can really look like. And that is when all of the jurisdictions come together. So we have one aligned bullseye of requirements. Those requirements that have been thought through and put in place with the purpose of providing the most safe and effective products to patients in a timely fashion. And there on the right-hand side, you can see that from a manufacturer perspective, we can very quickly hit that bullseye and get that product to each jurisdiction at the same time. And a good example of the convergent regulation that Tracy was actually talking about in her talk is IMDRF at the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, who is a group of regulators that have come together for a number of years and bring their wisdom and experience to develop these convergent regulations and recommendations for other regulators to adopt. Let's see, there we go. All right. One of the things I thought would be very interesting for us to kind of take a look at today is the total product life cycle of convergence. Yeah, there are a lot of intricacies when it comes to developing and launching a product. And from a manufacturing perspective, we see differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and a lot of the different aspects of the total product life cycle. So if we look at the table on the right-hand side of the screen, one of the first and foremost foundational principles from a regulator's perspective that we encourage is to adopt medical device and IVD classifications that are consistent with IMDRF's recommendations. IMDRF has a document for medical device classification as well as IVD classification and software as a medical device. And getting started on the right foot, so to speak, is very important because all of the downstream requirements related to the products are based on the classification because it is a risk-based classification, right? It's based on the risk to patients. Also, another thing that we would encourage is the implementation of an expedited pathway for innovative products and emergency use. We saw a lot of these emergency use authorization pathways emerging during COVID-19, but every single one of them was slightly different. So it gets back to that bullseye in the previous slide. If we could get to one harmonized approach to emergency use authorization, develop products that would reach patients much faster. Of course, aligning to the essential principles, IMDRF has an excellent document that regulators can take a look at as well as manufacturers for meeting the essential principles for evidence requirements. Of course, being able to leverage global clinical data so we're not repeating the same clinical trials from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And another thing that we also saw kind of get highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic was adopting e-labeling. Some jurisdictions still require paper labeling, and that was definitely a challenge, not only from a timing perspective with COVID, but from a potential contamination perspective, right, with people handling paper. So we wanted to be able to encourage the adoption of e-labeling in order to facilitate faster access to the most updated product information and to protect from any cross-contamination or exposure to COVID, for example. And then moving on, also IMDRF, UDI cybersecurity requirements, adopting a risk-based approach to modifications, allowing the use of real-world evidence, and driving the digitization of the regulatory processes in order to help achieve interoperability and perhaps, you know, at some point in time be able to take advantage of innovations like cloud submissions. So really, when you kind of go around this circle, it's about the total product life cycle, and it's about convergence on each one of these topics and more. And Sandra, I will probably skip a couple slides just to help you make up some time, just so you know. But I wanted to cover this slide because it covers the benefits of international harmonization. And Melissa Torres of the US FDA provided an update at the GHWP annual meeting. And in this presentation, she included these benefits. So I think it's important to see it from a regulator's perspective as well, because it provides earlier patient access, it reduces the unnecessary duplication, it streamlines the regulatory processes themselves, it reduces cost by avoiding duplication of effort, and it stimulates innovation. So the US FDA has an example of how different jurisdictions could adopt convergent activities in order to drive changes in their regulatory framework. And if you think about it, anytime we're trying to implement change, we try to think about how do we operationalize that and how do we measure it. And so from the US FDA's perspective, they're looking at a 5-year strategic plan. And that plan includes engaging with additional collaboration throughout the global community, and it includes the use of international standards when possible, minimizing country-specific deviations, building confidence and trust with other regulators, and the use of least burdensome principles. So to dive just a little bit further into that so you guys can see a little bit more detail, one of their goals is to expand engagement and participation in international forums. They're also going to further support regulatory convergence by creating a mechanism for FDA to work with regulatory partners. And I think this is key because that knowledge sharing and capacity building amongst the regulatory community will benefit changes in the future that will lead to convergence. And another interesting point that they're going to focus on is they're going to assess the extent of their own implementation of IMDRF technical documents, and they're going to make that publicly available. And I think that shows, an important leadership example that they can see where they have and have not implemented IMDRF technical documents and share that with the public. Real quick, I just want to mention also IMDRF did announce recently an affiliate membership program. I think this is an excellent opportunity for other jurisdictions to get involved to learn more about the IMDRF documents. That capacity building is really important. It allows you to participate in open meetings and working groups. And so I encourage you to get involved in that. And then I just want to comment very quickly on the bit that Agnes presented. I'm sorry she couldn't be here with us today, but she presented on the global model regulatory framework. And I really do appreciate the work that the WHO is doing because their global model regulatory framework really encompasses some of the necessary requirements to even lay the groundwork for regulation, right? Like the legal requirements. And I also think that they've made great strides from the previous version in May to the version I think that we saw later on in 2022. They made significant progress, I think, towards working with the IMDRF community, for example, and adoption of the international best practice in the global model regulatory framework. There are still a few areas that we would encourage WHO to continue to converge upon. For example, in the post-market requirements, aligning the definition of adverse event, and then eliminating perhaps some of the requirements that aren't value added from a safety perspective, such as in-country lot testing. And then again, we want to make sure that we continue to work with the WHO and encourage them to align the GPT Plus tool, which is the framework that they would use to measure the maturity of a regulator. We encourage them to make the changes and update the GPT Plus so that it aligns with the advances that they made in the global model regulatory framework. So as you guys have seen in multiple presentations, having multiple jurisdiction requirements can delay the access to safe and effective products already launched in other jurisdictions, whether that's in-country clinical trials, specific dossier formats, specific labeling, specific inspection requirements, or post-market reporting. So with that, I would conclude that with the experience that we all survived, I think, in COVID, that our future certainly lies in our opportunity to embrace convergence and to implement smart regulation and to help each other build our capacity and understanding of how we can accelerate access to products. Thank you. Back to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much, Tammy. And I'd appreciate if we may have Tracy and Eka opening your cameras. Maybe we'll start with a Q&A session that would, I think, make it more friendly, the conversation more friendly, sorry. And probably I would like to get started with Tracy. I think that, I mean, all convergence efforts are definitely very positive, and I think all stakeholders value all the efforts that are being done. However, we still see opportunities for all those different convergence efforts to actually converge among themselves. And in that regard, it would be really interesting to learn. And again, it's a pity that we do not have Agnes in here also to share her, the WHO perspective. But at least if you could share what is IMDRF, if you're in a position to share, doing, like in working with WHO or with ASEAN in order to make sure that all the initiatives that are being taken moving forward are really converging among themselves.
Absolutely, great question. And certainly that's the question that we asked ourselves at the IMDRF meeting in Sydney last year. And at that meeting, we recognised that there are efforts by other organisations for particular purposes and reasons. And we tried to explore and invite those organisations along to engage with the IMDRF Management Committee to understand what was leading to the development of other frameworks on what seems to be similar guidance materials on similar topics, because we recognise that it creates confusion, it generates a duplication of effort. So the IMDRF did agree that as part of the strategic plan that it released last year, they would make a real effort to engage, understand, and try and reduce the number of times that documents would have to be generated. So we started the journey last year. This year, IMDRF is meeting in Brussels in a couple of weeks, and we will continue that conversation. And the alliances and some formal ways of partnering and maybe working together is hopefully what will come out of those meetings and those negotiations. But it is on our radar, and we're taking steps to address it.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And it was interesting last week or a week before the last, during the GHWP meeting, that there are several initiatives within the working groups as to start comparing the guidelines that are produced by GHWP in regards of IMDRF. So I think at this point in time, this is a great effort. However, we are kind of like probably, and forgive me if I am too direct to the point, a little bit too late. I think it would be even better if we could start from the very beginning, aligning among all those initiatives, because at the end of the day, these recommendations on preventing duplicative efforts, are still there. I mean, it is really duplicative effort to go and review something from zero that has already been developed by another group of experts. And that is the thing. I mean, all of them are developed by several groups of experts, and combining all those experiences from the very beginning, I think the world will certainly benefit out of that. The patients will certainly benefit out of that. So we really congratulate IMDRF on these initiatives, and of course listening from GHWP and others, including WHO, to start working in a much more collaborative way, and from earlier stages. Again, that could really benefit all the patients around the globe. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and that was the point. That was the point I made in my session, was that encouraging that earlier involvement in working groups and the public consultation process is the place to start, because if we get people involved at the early stage, we can incorporate the requirements of those organisations or countries who may wish to utilise the guidance later on, or have a rationale as to why it hasn't been included, because there may be some rational explanations as to why certain things can't be included. So that transparency of what's adopted and what's not adopted is another area that we do need to focus on, and that's in our strategic plan. But you're quite right. For those guidance documents that are already out there, there does have to be a looking at the connections between them, unfortunately.
Yes, and you're making a fantastic point that we generally also highlight. I mean, the relevance of an active participation of all relevant stakeholders during public consultations. And this is something that we find kind of like often. We generally tend to talk to the regulators and ask to do and to follow good regulatory practices. But sometimes by the time it is for the industry, for other stakeholders to take an active role during the open public consultations, that does not necessarily happen, or that does not necessarily happen at the level of quality with sound-based support on the comments. So that is something that we also have to acknowledge, and that is something that as industry, we definitely also have to do way better as compared to what we have been doing in the past years.
I'm glad you say that, because as an example, I chair the personalised medical devices working group, and our most recent consultation, which was public, personalised medical devices is a very large area of unregulation at the moment. We got comments from 2 countries. So that engagement is really important, and so based on those 2 countries, and there was only 4 submissions from 2 countries. The IMDRF has to make a decision in relation to the guidance that it publishes. Is there enough in that submission process to publish a global guidance, or is there not? But you're quite right. The industry does have to pay attention as well as the regulators, and work together to make sure that we have guidance documents that are fit for purpose and that are useful for everyone.
Thank you, Tracy. And that would probably lead me to another question. I mean, how do you see as regulators in ECA and TAMI as industry, do you see that all these convergence efforts coming from different institutions are also competing for the available resources, both at the national regulatory authorities and the industry, to comment on those? Because there are many different documents coming up for public consultations, and what happens with the available never sufficient resources? In ECA, probably we may get started with you, and then we go with TAMI.
I think she's on mute. There she is. Okay.
Oh, please tell me first.
Oh, no, you please go ahead. Definitely.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. In my experience in the regulation for to make a regulation for medical devices, we do public consultation first for make sure the regulation is can implement it well by manufacturer or other distributor, and and then we make evaluation the input from them, where the input from the manufacturer or other sector can make facilitated to make the regulation good for implementation by the manufacturer or other sectors. We discuss with other sectors also by government or institution or association of manufacturer or distributor.
Thank you, Eka. Tammy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Sandra. And I, having commented on, I don't know how many documents over the weekend, over holidays, over anniversaries, birthdays, it's always so critically important to prioritize those, because if you think about it, that is your opportunity to use your voice, not only to share, where there might be sticking points or areas that need to be more closely aligned, but it's also your opportunity to impact the access that patients will have to those products. And sometimes regulators, they have so many other responsibilities that they're working on. They don't always know all of the innovations and opportunities that are experienced in other jurisdictions. And from a global perspective, if I'm working on a document in Brazil, or I see a document coming out of Australia, and I see an IMDRF document, and then I see a GHWP strategic plan who's going to work on the same document, it's my responsibility and my accountability to speak up and to use my voice and to help explain, we have an opportunity here to align and to maybe avoid some work that doesn't need to be done if we can just adopt an international practice that already exists, which kind of gets us back to the beginning of the first session where we talk about technical barriers to trade. And when we're talking about, the opportunity to adopt international practices that already exist, that is exactly what we're talking about, because it facilitates the trade between the countries in order to be able to import and export those products more easily. It also helps domestic companies be able to develop that product according to an international standard that already exists and be able to export that product more quickly because it meets the requirements that other regulators are going to expect. So yeah, what I would encourage to everyone on the phone is sign up for notifications from your regulator, sign up for ePing. I know Stephen's going to love that I said that, but sign up for ePing. Make sure that you're checking different sources and use your voice. Be kind, be honest, be educated, ask questions, but don't hold your voice when there's something that can be improved.
Thank you very much, Tammy. And that sounds really great. But if we come down to reality, resources are never sufficient. And both at the national regulatory authorities and at the industry level, there it is always kind of like the short-term responsibilities versus the mid-long-term ones. And in that regard, there could be a lot of good intentions and a lot of understanding on the great opportunities that this open public consultation brings. But sometimes it is simply a matter of not having enough resources to go and have an active, sound participation, because it is not a matter just of commenting for the sake of commenting. I mean, we are all responsible to submit base science proposals. Otherwise, we're also making whomever is opening the consultation wasting their time responding to comments that are not well strongly based. But how do we deal with that? I mean, at the National Regulatory Authority's perspective and as industry, to those competing documents that are expected to be commented on. Mm-hmm. So probably, Tracy, we may get started with you and then Eka and then Tammy.
All right. Two things. The first thing I'd say is just to reflect on the changes that are impacting everyone from the move to the European MDR, because the European MDR is taking up so much time and effort from not only the manufacturers, but also the other jurisdictions and regulators who are trying to understand, well, what does that mean for devices that are coming with different certifications? So I think today we're operating in a really different world where we have to be putting our mind's eye onto that because it has real implications for supply. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is coming out of COVID, most all countries, the national governments are thinking about domestic manufacturing and ongoing supply sustainability. So here again, manufacturers are being pulled into conversations about, well, how and what should we maintain in terms of modern manufacturing and sustainability of supply chains, particularly for small markets. And I know in Australia that's taking up a lot of our time. So then we get to the consultations and the number of consultations that come out. So we've tried to work with our industry groups to have a multi-pronged approach. And by that, we offer a range of different ways where they can provide their input. And a way could be that we will offer to identify which consultations will have a potential impact on which types of devices and which manufacturers, to try and narrow the focus on who should be looking at the document. And the next option we might offer is, well, we'll offer a couple of webinars to go through what the changes are, what the likely impacts are, questions and answers, so that you don't have to sit down and write a response if you don't wish to, but we will take notes as part of that verbal conversation and that discussion piece going forward. So I think if you can break it down, and the other option we've done is where we've done consultations, we've broken it up into easy sort of consumer focused ways of answering the questions about the regulatory changes. So you don't have to read through all long bits of documents. We've done a shortened version with specific questions that people can answer quite easily and quickly if they don't have, the time or effort to go through the long process. So just thinking about how can you make it easier? Yes, it does rely on my staff putting a bit more effort into it, but the benefits coming out of it really outweigh that.
Sandra, you're on mute.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Sandra.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
That was my miming.
I'm so sorry. So, Eka, do you have any comment in this regard?
Yeah, I think it's enough. Yeah, same with Tracy. We do also to make the manufacturer or distributor have responsibility for quality, safety, and efficacy of the product. They should follow the regulation to guarantee the product is safety for use, efficacy, and good quality.
Thank you. Tammy?
Yeah, I think your question is really around how do we prioritize when there's so many different jurisdictions changing requirements and global organizations coming out with new documents and consultations. Yeah, so, and that's a tough one. I think, getting involved with local, regional, and global associations, right? Making sure that you are linked into your jurisdiction's changes so that you get notification, and weigh the changes that you may see. Look at the title of the document. If it's a document that's changing the overall classification of your products, that should be one that you are very interested in, right? so I think that, within our organizations, we have to prioritize what types of changes are being made. We have to monitor those changes, and we have to take advantage of opportunities. For example, New Zealand is working on establishing their first-time regulation. This is an incredible opportunity for New Zealand to learn from all of these other regulators and industry experiences to implement those innovations the first time, right, with their first pass. So when you see new regulation emerging like that is brand new, you should take the time, because you're helping that country get started on the right foot, to be able to sustain and to be efficient, to be able to provide safe and effective products for the long term. So it's not an easy answer, Sandra. And at the end of the day, you just sometimes got to put the hard work in, and you got to stay connected, and you got to be willing to take the time to speak up when there's opportunities to prevent regulation, right, or guidances before they even develop. So I guess that's what I would say. And if others on the call have ideas, I'm all ears. I'm a lifelong learner.
I think the other point to make is sometimes when you do a consultation and manufacturers or peak bodies don't have the time to go through it, and the regulator goes through and gets the approval to change the regulations, the regulator also has to be open for thinking about whether refinements are needed later on. And I think what we've demonstrated here in Australia is we've made a number of refinements to recent regulations because not everyone had the time and effort to think through the implications of the regulatory changes that we're going through, because they were new and no one had traversed this area before. So the other point that the regulator needs to be very humble about is making sure that it's open to hearing the implications and making refinements to regulations and pushing those through as well.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And I think you're raising a really very, very important point, because at the end of the day, I think we should have like a very smart balance between all the specifics on the contents of a new regulatory framework or an updated regulation, not only in regards of the technical requirements, but on the actual feasibility to implement it. And that all comes to the scene whenever we are following, or as we are following, good regulatory practices. Because by the time we put in place and we run a thorough regulatory impact assessment, there we will find a lot of the answers prior to getting into a more advanced stage of the process, when we might realize that, fine, this is a wonderful piece of regulation, but we do not have the resources available to implement it. And that is a pity, because that's a lot of effort that it is involved in again, challenging within the process on whether this has already been done by somebody else that we can rely upon. And then the answer is going to be, okay, we will rely upon the decisions that somebody else that we are trusting on is making, instead of having to fully implement those pieces of regulations. And sorry that I am here very confident, just continuing with the conversation and really expecting not to be abusing of your time, because we are experiencing some technical issues, and most probably Scott is not going to be available to join. So if it is okay with you, may we go like 5 more minutes in the conversation, because I think there is never sufficient time for us to complete all the ideas that are being shared and to respond to the questions. So if I can have you for like another 5 minutes, I'll really appreciate it. Okay, perfect. So we could probably get started with some of the questions that we have in the Q&A feature. The first one is directed to Tammy. Could you more specifically 1IV dossier from your slides, saying in the country of this anonymous attendee, some product register needs more specific and complex documents that difficulty to get from the global teams? So Grace, what do you mean by 1IV dossier?
Yeah, so those of you that are familiar, IMDRF also has a table of contents for medical devices, and they also have one for IVDs. And Tracy, I'm sure, can shed light on those as well. I think the intent behind those documents are to help us all get to eventually one dossier that would meet the requirements of multiple jurisdictions. We talked about earlier how convergence and reliance are interrelated. So if we can converge the requirements for a dossier, it makes it easier for countries to rely on the decisions that other regulators made because they have trust and confidence in the information that they've reviewed and that they have accepted. So to get to one dossier, I mean, that's sort of like the nirvana, right? So if you're from a manufacturer's perspective, if I can oversimplify for a minute, you would develop one dossier to be submitted to each regulator and to the WHO's pre-qual program, right? Instead, what we're doing today is developing and comprising a dossier for every single jurisdiction, and it differs from every single jurisdiction, and it differs for the WHO pre-qual program. And when we talked about earlier, we are all here trying to develop and provide timely access to safe and effective products. Each jurisdiction has that in mind when they're writing their requirements. So it begs to differ or makes us wonder, why are they sometimes different? If we all have that same goal, why are the requirements so different? And I understand, you know, sometimes there are unique characteristics perhaps for different populations that might require additional testing or different types of testing or labeling. And I don't disagree with that. I just think that there are times when there are jurisdiction specific requirements that have developed over time that perhaps could be looked at and perhaps converge to something that is more like one dossier, the nirvana of one dossier. So that's what was meant by that.
Thank you, Tammy.
I can add to that if you like.
Please.
So there is a specific working group in the IMDRF looking at developing and agreeing one set of table of contents. So the idea is that if we could agree on the table of contents, that is a really good step because they're all agreeing on the content of what an application would look like. The US FDA and Health Canada have got a spin-off project where they are trialing an electronic version of how you would submit one document that would then go to each of the regulators at the same time. And that project also builds in where there are differences. So there are differences between the two countries, and it's important that those differences are spelt out clearly so that the applicant can put in all of the standard consistent information and then a little bit to address what Health Canada might need that's different, and if there's any specific things that the US FDA has different as well. And Australia has also put our hand up to be part of that process, because I think electronic submission and being able to support getting to a harmonised convergent approach is something that we would really appreciate, given that you know, over 98% of devices that come to Australia are imported either from the US or Europe. So we do have a vested interest in supporting convergent activities and efforts.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And I think that is the reality for most of the countries in the globe. Most of the medical devices are imported for all the countries. It doesn't matter if it ends up being like a US labeled product. At the end of the day, it is being manufactured based on components that are being sourced from many different places in the globe. So at the end of the day, we end up all importing a lot of those. In probably building on what you were mentioning, Tracy, on these that could be like slight differences. It also comes to the equation, the relevance of the proper application and utilization of international standards, and beyond that, not only the utilization but the active involvement in their development. And for that, we also congratulate IMDRF for having started this liaison program with international development organizations, because that is where I mean the strongest wealth of knowledge is available, and where both regulators and all relevant stakeholders can make really very sound decisions as to put to the service of the world the knowledge that is available, and to come up with the best possible solutions in regards of defining requirements for products to be approved. I mean, for the features that the products and the characteristics that products should be compliant with in order to perform and deliver as expected by the design. So then differences are going to be way smaller. But in that regard, again, we come with the competing of the resources, and probably it could be great to learn from TGA experience, as we're not able to learn at this point from the US FDA. How did you transition from developing your own technical requirements to the world of international standards? Of course, beyond legal obligations, I mean, there is all this change in the mindset at the regulators level to get into the standards world. How did you manage to do that, not only from the philosophical perspective, but also from the actual available resources perspective?
So it obviously happened before my time, but what I can say is that it helps that you have a national government who is willing to do that. So I understand that there was a significant amount of discussion and consultation about whether or not Australia should continue doing its own thing, or whether we had the confidence in the abilities and the processes by other regulators. So that confidence building and that confirmation of how other regulators go about the process of assessing and approving products in other countries was a key determinant of being able to satisfy the government here in Australia that it was going to be okay. What you have to do, however, is have mechanisms in place to identify where you do find something that doesn't quite sit quite right with you. And in Australia, whilst we recognise other various countries' approvals, there were some very high-risk products that we maintained our sovereign right to still approve and assess ourselves, because we believed at that time that the regulatory frameworks were not consistent, and they were and the approach to those products was very varied. So we maintained our ownership of those ones. Now that changed 2 years ago. We put forward to the government that times had changed, that regulatory frameworks in other countries, including Europe, were being uplifted in terms of the arrangements under the EU MDR. And we put forward that we should now not do those mandatory assessments for the Australian market. So it does depend on your government. It also does depend on being able to have that level of confidence and understanding of the other regulators and how they go about their business. So we go through a rigorous process with other regulators to understand that, and it could take up to a year for us to develop that confidence and understanding.
Thank you very much for sharing, Tracy. I mean, I know that we have gone even beyond the time that that we had allocated for Scott. We still have a couple of questions that we will be responding in writing. One is addressed to the MDRC team, and the other one to the WHO. And there is another question in here that we will be sharing with the appropriate person, so we may have them responded. So with these, really thank you very much for this very fruitful conversation. And then I'll pass it over to Mugan for the closing comments. Thank you very much again.
All right, thank you, Sandra and Tracy, Tammy, and Eka. Thank you once again. We are, as Sandra said, a little over time, so I will save my recap of today's workshop for tomorrow. I hope it was an enlightening session for participants today. And I look forward to seeing you again virtually tomorrow for day 2 of the workshop. We are going to be going more in depth into practical implementation and contextualizing of reliance models to streamline medical device assessment and post-market surveillance. So thank you all and see you tomorrow. Bye.